Hi, my name is Bechir Pierre. Today we're going to be talking about the achievement gap. So when you ask what the achievement gap is, it's one of the major issues in education right now. And it's the persistent and also relatively consistent gap in learning and actual educational outcomes of various groups. You actually see the largest persistent achievement gap between white students and African American students. You see a smaller but still large gap between white students and Latino students. Actually, not as much, and even a reverse achievement gap between Asian American students and white students. You do see a gap between boys and girls. If you look at the Northeast versus the South, you do see a pretty strong achievement gap. And one that has remained consistent and very hard to erase has been the gap between students from high-income families and students from lower-income families. The poorest 10% of students are actually 3 to 4 years of learning behind the top 10% wealthiest students in the same age group. In terms of socioeconomic status, there are a lot of different factors that drive this achievement gap. Many high-income families live in quiet areas versus low-income families might live in loud urban centers. And so the actual sound is distracting and actually a detriment to the learning of students. Imagine trying to do your homework and there's a consistent loud drone in your background versus the peace and quiet of a high-income area. The achievement gap begins really early. And so imagine your parent is a professor versus a parent who is a worker at a steel plant. The professor, from your birth, their ability to use like complex language and complex sentence structures or even use certain words stimulates your mind in a way that potentially your steel mill parent cannot. And that already creates a gap between certain students. In lower income areas, you often find lower quality schools. This isn't always the case, but across the United States, this is often the case. And one of the major reasons for that is in many areas, public school districts are directly funded through property taxes. So with the attachment of property taxes to educational systems, having a higher value of home adds to the educational quality of the schools. There have been initiatives to change some of those factors where take a certain group and you move them to a wealthier school district. That doesn't erase the achievement gap. It definitely shrinks it. But that tells us that there are other factors beyond just switching the environment. It's often far for a student to travel to get to that wealthy district. So the student still lives in a home that is in poverty, but to even get to that wealthy school district, many of those students are traveling maybe multiple hours in a day just to get to school. And so that's additional stress on the educational capability of the student, just their ability to get things done. They just have a limited window to get it done. One of the things that was tried was a program called Head Start. A program started as a more comprehensive early childhood education and also health and nutrition program for low-income children and their families. The coronavirus might become one of the most harmful shocks to the educational system that we've seen in some time. First and foremost, there's the stress of potentially having a sick family member, not knowing what's going to happen next. And also now, like a lot of these students, especially the poorer ones, who maybe are living in a more cramped space, maybe they don't have their own living area. They don't have their own room that they can go to, or the laptop that they would use to study or learn is shared, or their ability to access high bandwidth internet is limited. So there are all these hurdles. Coronavirus, I think, will be very challenging to overcome and actually will harm the learning of a lot of students. So what can actually be done about this achievement gap? This is one of the most important questions of our time. In order to actually see a reduction in the achievement gap, this is something that needs to be done over time. I think the use of technology to democratize education is something that more and more districts and schools need to look at. When you ask if there's one thing that hasn't been tried or hasn't been tried enough to reduce the opportunity gap Honestly, I think that one thing might be increasing the standard of living for our poorest families. Because wealth is often generational and structurally persistent, creating structures that do support families that find themselves in this structural rut of poverty, I think would actually create the biggest impact on the achievement gap.